Welcome to the Soul of Medicine.
Hi, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming on. So today's podcast is entitled Unlocking the Brain-Body Connection with Somatic Experiencing Therapy with our guest today, Maja Cupac. Hi, good to see
Hello.
you.
Good to
It's
see
great.
you too.
So glad you're here. So let me just give you an introduction. So Maja was born and raised in Croatia. War broke out when she was 10 years old, forcing her and her family out of her beloved country at gunpoint. Maja was forced into exile in a neighboring country and eventually came to the United States as a refugee. She was placed in Kentucky where she immersed herself in academia and set out on her path to help others. She has over 15 years of experience treating a variety of mental health issues, and Maja primarily practices somatic experiencing and neurofeedback in her practice in Louisville, Kentucky, called Olive Tree Counseling. Welcome, Maja.
Thank you, Kay.
So great for you to be here. Is there a significance to the olive tree in your practice?
Oh, yes, plenty. I wish I could give you a simple explanation, but I just cannot. Where I'm from, olive trees grow very well, very rapidly. They are all over the place, and olive trees can live for, gosh, hundreds of years. So to me, there was this idea with like olive tree, like something that you plant, something that can be so well grounded and thrive, right? Because I believe that humans have the same capacity, if you will. We can all recover, we can all regain our power that sometimes somewhere can and could be lost.
Definitely. And it has a peace symbolism as well, right? The
Oh,
olive tree, I believe.
yes, yes, it does.
Awesome. That's so cool. So I first found you, I believe I was searching for you online, and I was specifically looking for a somatic experiencing therapist, knowing that, and we're going to talk more about what somatic is. And I truly believe in the practice that, not in the practice, but in my way of practicing, that the body and the mind are connected, emotions are trapped in the body, and this then is what leads to pathology. And oftentimes in psychotherapy, there's a lot of talk therapy, and that there's just so much neck up and where the issues are really neck down. And we'll go more into what that means, like that kind of approach to trauma therapy or any kind of therapy for that matter. And so as a physician and a pharmacist and what we do in the practice, we're mainly dealing with the body. And when we see refractory cases or people not getting better, this link, I believe, is the thing that's really missing in medicine, of linking the body and the mind, emotions and the mind. And if we're just treating the physical body with medications or supplements or surgeries, etc., we're really not getting into those deep roots. So therefore the patient doesn't have true healing or sustainable healing for that matter.
I very much agree with what you're saying, Kay, but I also think that the same is the truth for psychotherapy, right? We go to therapists to talk. And that's all we do. And generally speaking, therapists are just kind of trained in some version of cognitive or emotional experiences. And there is a big disconnect in my own field between the mind and the body. One of the things that I have learned is that everything happens because of physiology. And we simply don't take that into consideration, right? And even when we talk about trauma, we are trained to address specific types of traumas, right? And when we talk about trauma, it always has to be psychological, where many therapists completely ignore other varieties of trauma, like medical trauma being one of those. How often do you go to see a therapist who's going to ask you, how many surgeries have you had? How many times have you been put under? It just doesn't happen. And I mean, that's also to say that these kinds of traumas also play such a huge role on person's, well, mental health, if you will, or from the perspective of somatic experiencing body's ability to kind of organize itself, to regulate itself.
Could you define for us somatic experiencing, or even the word, somatic in general? It's been such this catchword that a lot of people are using now. You could probably get on Instagram and, all those things are flying around of
Oh, I
somatic therapy,
know.
somatic movement, somatic
I
trainings,
know.
somatic.
I know. And to be honest with you, I don't know what any of that really and truly means. I also have patients that come to me and they're like, "Oh, I just really need somatic work." It's like, what is somatic work? Well, yeah, it has something to do with body. I do yoga, right? So yes, the word is being thrown left and right, but I think that just general public truly doesn't have the right way to conceptualize what somatic is. Somatic comes from the word soma, which means body. And so, with somatic experiencing, Dr. Peter Levine is the one who has created this particular modality. And so, somatic experiencing is a way to access trauma and trauma related stress responses. So again, attention is not played necessarily on cognition, if you would, but rather on internal sensations of a person, right? And again, like I said, everything starts with physiology. Physiology creates sensations. Emotions are a byproduct of such. And so with somatic experiencing, that is really what you're trying to access. You're trying to access sensations. You try to access location of these sensations, and you use body to process, understand, and discharge what needs to be discharged. You use activation because many of my patients also say, like they don't have necessarily much of a capacity to handle sympathetic arousal, right? And they're so fearful. It's like, oh, I just need to be calm. I just need to be calm. But you always need an amount of sympathetic arousal in order to really work with sensations and everything else that comes with that.
Could you define for us trauma? Because so we say the big T trauma and little T trauma, and when I don't know that people really recognize, like what you said, that they have trauma, because it's always the big T, which you'll define trauma is that my childhood was fine. Nothing really major happened to me. So in not understanding, the true definition of what that can encompass, like you said, medical traumas or surgical things, even childbirth traumas, like
Yes,
women go through that. I mean, it's
yes.
huge. And because we are so used to having babies and so expected to bounce back so quickly, that wasn't even a thing. I mean, there's a lot of expectations. I know for myself, I didn't want to have C-sections, and I did. And I wasn't prepared for that. So a lot of
Mhm.
my locked emotions in my body are around my C-sections. Every time I have it worked on, there's just layers
So
and
much
layers
that
of
comes
things
up.
around that.
Yeah.
Exactly. So could you define for everybody what trauma actually means, or what it could mean?
That's a quite difficult task because trauma, like somatic experiencing, is a word or a phrase that people just throw around. Um, I've said that quite a few times and people get upset with me. Not everything's trauma. Some things are just hard, but that doesn't make them traumatic. So when we talk about trauma, because, there's a variety of traumas. There's trauma that's done to the body. There's trauma, there's relational trauma for sure. Think about an infant whose parents are not capable of being physically present, attuned, or really able to take care of them, right? Or a child who needs to be separated for whatever reason from his or her parents, right? This is grossly going to affect the way that we are capable of attaching and do relationships later on in life. And then we can also talk about traumas, that are there surrounding life-threatening events. Some of those being drowning, for example, that's also something that comes to my mind, strangulation. That's also kind of linked to a near-death experience, right? Or something horrific such as war or witnessing or being part of combat.
Well, I mean, I think it's really interesting. So I studied with Gabor Mate a bit.
Uh-huh.
I'm sure you know who he is. And
Of course
his,
I do.
which I didn't really realize, but what he said was the original trauma was that your parent or caregiver did not attune to you,
Yes,
which
yes,
was
that's
so, which was like, that blew my mind because it means, not that we're saying that our parents didn't love us or that we didn't have our needs met,
no,
but the
no,
mere
no.
fact, especially if you are a sensitive child that didn't feel safe in articulating that you felt sad or that you were being bullied at school, and his line of thinking was, how old does this memory go back and who did you tell? And usually the answer for a kid is no one. Well, why? Because I didn't feel safe to do that. I didn't want to get somebody in trouble. I didn't want to get in trouble, where you had to disassociate or kind of figure it out on your own, or your nervous system had to adapt in some way, set you up for these other big T and other little t traumas, if you will, that are what you were talking about. So I never really thought about just not being understood, or, that was a big, huge thing. That was the original. And so if we all look at it that way, it happens to all of us.
I also believe that every single parent does the best he or she can given the place, time, circumstances, support, so on and so forth, and also given their own trauma or maybe intergenerational trauma, right? But just because somebody's doing their best doesn't mean that they're doing a wonderful job. So there are adults, there are parents who are capable very much of connection and fine attunement with their baby. And some are simply just lacking.
And I feel that there's a majority that don't. So to be attuned to a child, I mean, it takes a lot of time and energy and your own attunement to yourself
Yes,
to be able
yes.
to attune to another person. So, I mean, so I guess what I'm saying is that I almost find that a rarity and a blessing in a lot of people, right? Because we're busy and we're not always attuned to ourselves, but it's become more commonplace, that I find, than of a parent not being attuned to. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it just sort of opened my eyes of like, when I'm, that it happens a lot.
It does. But I would also encourage you to look into the structures that our system has, right? You get pregnant, you give birth to a child, and you have what, month and a half of maternity leave? And what happens to your baby? You give it to complete strangers in some kind of daycare, right? Your baby is not with you, even though your voice is the first noise, the first sound that your baby is capable of recognizing, and the smell of your own skin is smell that your baby is capable of recognizing. So attachment hasn't even really fully formed yet. And you give your child away, right? For 8, 9, 10 hours every single day. And then we also had all of these theories, and was a big proponent of like crying it out. Yes, it says the parents were very much encouraged. Take your child, put your child in their bed. They will cry. Don't cave. Don't go in. Do not soothe, and baby will learn how to sleep by themselves. And in reality, what happens is that this infant whose very existence, whose very life depends on you, gives up and collapses. But people have been encouraged for decades to do just that, right? And we often don't even validate children. A child cries, right? Child falls and cries. Come on, nothing's wrong with you. Get up, get up, get up. Or, oh, don't pick him up. He's going to be fine. Right? So we are not necessarily, as a culture, generous with our way to nurture our young. We are moving or have been moved towards growth, independence that is just not age appropriate.
I agree with you. Exactly. So that leads me to, the ACE study, that were done,
Right?
these adverse childhood experiences, which was a landmark study that was, pretty much predicting chronic illness in adults based on the ACE score, the adverse childhood experience score,
Yes.
in the child. So it's so interesting, and how important those things that you were saying, that attunement in whatever capacity, is so crucial in the well-being and the emotional well-being and resilience of children, from a very young age. So we're talking about the child from that end. And so when by the time they get into our office, right, we see this high sympathetic over time, because
Yes.
it's so we see it as inflammation, chronic illness, cardiovascular disease, fatigue.
Also as syndromes, right?
Yes, yeah, and
Hmm.
yes, exactly, and pain, and
Yes.
chronic in, irritable bowel, inflammatory bowel
Yeah.
disease. So the way that we look at it's like, okay, so we can get to the root cause of that, what we say, but then, so maybe it's diet, gut, adrenals that are causing this, and hormone imbalance. But if you really look at it, what was driving those adrenals in the first place? Because that's a very chronic, process of having that much inflammation happening, or that much fatigue. So making this connection with that trauma, or not trauma, but that sympathetic mode going all the time, which was driven by what you were just saying of the adaptation for whatever. So just making this connection of, it's interesting making your connection with what we see in the office and what you're trying to dig up in the office, needs to really kind of come together, to have, I think, full healing. Why is it so disconnected? Why is this such a disconnected thing anymore?
I really think that Rene Descartes started it, right? He said, mind's mind, body's body. That's just it. And from there, we decided that that's the truth and have been clinging on to that ever since. Emotional arousal or even discharge, it's still very much separate for them. Until I explain it in your body, what sensations are you noticing right now? Is there any tightness? Is there any, sensations can look like anything and they can feel like anything, right? And it's like, isn't that physiological phenomenon?
Yeah, and we have patients coming in maybe not wanting the medication, right? And then
Right,
they'll get on supplements because they want something more natural, or are
sure,
willing to change their lifestyle, exercise, eat better,
right,
etc. And then when we repeat labs, for instance, why are the sugars still up? Why is the A1C still up?
uh-huh.
Why is there still inflammation in the body? So it seems like they're doing everything right from a lifestyle perspective. And this is that missing piece in there, I feel, or connection that needs to be made. Maybe this is something deeper. So in your practice, Maja, how would you start to peel the onion, per se, or start to make those connections, help the patient make those kinds of connections, that something else deeper could be going on?
Oh, I do it from the get-go because I always do a pretty thorough assessment where I ask, like, what's your birth story? Do you know anything about your mother's pregnancy with you? So, like, from the get-go, there's that question. Did she receive enough nutrients? Were you born on time? How much stress did she live under? Was there any domestic violence? Was she ever punched in the stomach? At the same time, you also ask, what was the quality of the air that she was breathing, right? Like, what kind of house did this person live in? Did this woman had an access to medical care? And then also, what's your birth story like? Was the cord wrapped around your neck 10 times and you were born blue and now it's difficult for you to breathe? And you have to use drugs, right? In order to feel some sense of sympathetic arousal. Because death is the first thing that you've known.
That's amazing. And we think we forget that, or it doesn't matter when we chronologically get older, but that's so profound, what you just said right there.
So on the other side of that, like let's talk about like pharmacotherapy, like such as antidepressants.
Sure.
A lot of medications, what they do is they actually train people not to feel, right? So if we've got a serotonin inhibitor, it's down regulating. So the one thing you mentioned was the sensation that gets you to the discharge.
Right.
So you kind of got to feel to heal. So do you approach patients who maybe are on such antidepressants in a different way through somatic experience to get them to actually engage with feeling again?
That's a very wonderful question. Because I am not a medical doctor, I can't say anything to anyone about medication because my license limits me, right? But do I? Yes. Yes, because you're absolutely right. Like bunch of antidepressants, bunch of sedatives, you name it, right? Affect person's nervous system one way or the other. Sometimes I really believe that medication is necessary. But then at some point we should have a conversation about, can we titrate?
That's really interesting. So,
Yeah.
a lot of the chronic gut issues that we see too, are, we explain it. So it's almost like reverse engineering. So you come in with the digestive issues, and then it's like, okay, well, that's relative to the vagus nerve, and the vagus is activated by stress or trauma or all of
Yes.
that. And so
Yes.
just my basic intention here is that we start talking about this connection between the mind and body, because we're really missing something if it's only mind or only body,
Body.
and not
Yes.
knowing that we have this connection. So could you go over some techniques that you use in somatic experiencing? Like you mentioned something about the body awareness, grounding techniques, things like that.
Okay. One of the techniques is the use of VOO. VOO. Remember how we talked about ventral vagal nerve? Down regulation. So the point when you use the VOO is to take a breath, whatever breath is available to you. And there's also variations of VOO. So you take a breath in, and when you exhale, you go VOO. So the vibration alone originates in the stomach, right? It travels up your throat, out of your lips, right? Bones vibrate easily. So it transfers into your whole body. And plus, you provide plenty of oxygen to all of you. Another variation of VOO, it can be taking 3 breaths in and doing VOO until all of your breath is absolutely gone. Another one that's kind of like easy to use and maybe remember. See, I have this little towel that I keep in my office, right? And I keep it in my office because sometimes you will have people that are experiencing, from anger to, you mention it, right? And they're like, oh, it's stuck right here in my chest. It's here in my chest. And so what I tell them to do, right, is like, oh, imagine this sensation coming out of your chest and into your arms, and squeeze the towel. Squeeze it for as long as you can. Keep it squeezed. Feel your muscles. What else do? I make people shake because this is something that we see animals in the wild do. It's a good way to kind of discharge. Another thing that I always say to my patients, because I have to watch them, right? I have to be the attuned parent that maybe they never had, right? So I have to watch for their breathing patterns. I have to watch for any sympathetic arousal. I have to watch for any kind of discharge, right? But I'm also looking for the patterns of collapse too. And so what I tell them sometimes is just like, take a few minutes, roll your shoulders, just realize that you have shoulders. Move your hips as you're sitting because it's important. What's opposite of immobility, Kay? Mobility.
What's your idea of empath? So that word also is a buzzword that a lot of people say. Just how sensitive people are, do you think that's an adaptation from having to
It has to
be
be.
hyper vigilant? Mm-hmm.
It has to be. I think that this is something that's very easy to develop if you are growing up in a dysfunctional household, right?
Yes.
So you're small. You don't know the words, and there's no adults to guide you, right? So you have a mom who's very violent, maybe verbally. And then you have dad who's like sitting somewhere completely unavailable to you. Maybe he's getting drunk. Something like that, right? So you're small. You wake up and you enter your living room. Nobody's saying much to you, but what do you have to do so well? Read faces and read the mood. So you know exactly what to say and exactly what to do to not only prevent yourself from being harmed, but also for you to gain the very basic things that you need, such as love, approval, food, so on and so forth. And then you go into your adulthood doing just the same, right? Oh, I have this partner that I love very much, but I have to be completely attuned to every single thing that he does or doesn't do. Otherwise, I'm not safe. And what you also will have, I mean, this is like example of like other things too, with people who are very much merging and don't know the boundary.
Mm-hmm.
What do you
Yeah.
think of that?
Could you speak about boundaries, Maya?
I
For
can
our
speak about
audience?
boundaries. I can speak about variety of
Yeah.
boundaries, right?
Okay.
First and foremost, the body itself is a boundary, right? We have
Mm-hmm.
our skin that protects us from the others. Right? So how are we attuned enough to understand what the boundary is? Or if you're talking about the buzzword, right? How do you know when to stop merging? Because our nervous system corresponds to a nervous system of another person, right? Do you remember when your kiddos were small and something would happen to them and they would just cry or they would panic a little bit? They were so dysregulated. What would you have to do?
Right. So stay calm. So you're talking about the co-regulation, right? So
Yes, I'm
which
talking
is in,
about co-regulation.
which is interesting because it's sometimes if we're so don't have the boundaries, somebody responds, and I see this a lot. You probably see this too. So you try to establish the boundary, they don't like the boundary, then because you're co-regulating to their dysregulation, then you become dysregulated, then you lose the boundary, and then it happens all over again.
And that's when you have to ask people, would you benefit from couples counseling maybe? Right? Or what is it about you that plays this role so well that you have to stay within a relationship where you are pretty much a parent and a caregiver for your partner who doesn't know how to self-soothe? That's how you start to look into these things. But, what I try to explain to my patients is that our instinct is there for a reason. It's kind of this like finely attuned evolutionary thing, if you will, that has protected our species for this long, right? And then in like modern, quote unquote, modern society, right? We are pretty much taught to ignore it, not to look at it much, right? Use your brain. Use your brain. And there's always an explanation required. If you just say, but I just feel this way. But why? Or my patients, they absolutely require answers from me. Why? then it's like, can we just be curious with the idea that maybe there is no answer, but everybody wants to know why.
I actually like that because, as practitioners, that's why they come to us. Like, give me a reason. Rob, did you have any other question?
Yeah, I don't know if there's an exact answer to this, but earlier in the call when you started talking about trauma, you said there's trauma, but sometimes things are just hard. So how can someone identify, because it is a catchword, right? It is a catchphrase. And sometimes, there's some people that'll go with it. And it's trauma. And then there's some people that might actually have trauma, but hear that there's so much talk about the trauma, they might even reject it amongst themselves. So are there identifying factors on the difference?
I think that the matter is to what extent what happened to you. Was there a competent witness with you when it happened? And does this particular event is completely ruining your life that you are experiencing symptoms so severe? Or did you just get upset? Did you just get upset and that made your day kind of go to shit? Because not every single bad thing that happens is trauma. Sometimes you just fall off of your bike because there was a pebble, right? And maybe you skinned your knee and they're just gonna suck, right? But you can get back on your bike and you can bike home and you're gonna have dinner with whomever and you're gonna chit chat, you're gonna be able to connect eyes to eyes with another human, share a story, and you're fine, right? And other times, you fall off the bike, which triggers a memory. And maybe it's not even cognitive, but it triggers a memory when you were small and you fell from the bike and there was no one around to help you or to help you soothe. And all of a sudden, you feel like this helpless little child all over again. And you're crying and sobbing, but you don't know quite why because nothing significant happened, right? And you go to bed feeling dysregulated, you wake up and you're still not okay.
So what I'm hearing is it's less of that labeling of is it this, is it not this, and is there something that we need to work with in the body to be what you're saying, discharged
Right.
or attended to?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Okay. I love
That's
it.
why, literally, two people can have the same exact experience, trip on a pebble, fall off on a bike, but it's the everything around it that can define whether it was a trauma experience that carries into today or
Yeah.
it was just, I scraped my knee. Yeah.
Right. Peter Levine also talks about trauma as something that happens to us. God, I'm going to try to paraphrase this. Kind of like in relative isolation or in the absence of a witness. Say that I end up in a car crash, right? I'm not dead. And maybe my car is totaled, but maybe it's not. But, fuck the car. I was in a car accident, right? Maybe I broke my arm. The first thing that I see is a bunch of friendly faces looking at me, being concerned about me. I'll be fine, right? I'm connected. I feel cared for. I'm allowed to be vulnerable. But I'm in a car crash. And my husband comes and he screams at me, right? And the person that I crashed with is very upset and angry. There's a bunch of police. Or maybe somebody just hits my car and takes off. How's that going to translate? Quite differently.
That's really interesting. When they describe different types of psychogenic responses and disease states, like they've used World War II, veterans or people that were injured in war. And when they finally realized that they were in a safe space, their pain dramatically went down when they knew that they were cared for. So that's really fascinating. Yeah.
But that's how all of us work. I mean, I also, because I have a dog, right? When she feels all like hyper and crazy, if I pick her up, Just hold her and pet her head. She can melt into me too. Yeah.
All right. So how can one get in touch with you, Maya? They can see you in the
They,
office.
yeah, they can email me or they can call me or they can simply go to my website and send me an email from there.
Okay. So we can put that in the show notes. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you
We'll be in
guys.
touch.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Soul of Medicine podcast, where science meets soul for whole health healing. Are you ready to reclaim your energy, vitality, and soul purpose? Then feel free to head to our website at kcorpusmd.com and schedule an appointment for your root cause review.